Chapter 1 of Julia Ried. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 1 In Which I Find My Sphere. I am Julia Ried. All the people who were acquainted with my sister Esther will, perhaps, have some memory of me. There have been many changes in our family since Esther went to heaven. When Sadie was 20 she was married to Dr. Van Anden, and they went to live in New Haven. Soon after that our mother's health failed, so that she was unable to keep boarders any longer, and Dr. Van Anden opened his heart and his home and took mother and Minnie in. He wanted to take me, too, but his heart is larger than his home, and the latter was quite full enough without me, especially with my brother Alfred being a clerk in a dry goods store there and boarding with them. Indeed, the whole family just transplanted themselves one day to New Haven, this one branch excepted. Before that time, however, I came here. Here is a manufacturing town on the railroad 10 miles from our old home. One day I sat in my room, resting my elbows on the window seat and my head in my hands, and thought hard. I was 16. I had no money with which to continue my education. I could not live on my brother-in-law. I would not live on Uncle Ralph. I must support myself. How? I could teach a common district school. That is, I knew I could listen to recitations in spelling and geography and the like, but I also knew that I did not like the idea. The thought of the great bare schoolroom, with bruised seats, and dilapidated books piled on the desks, and a troop of naughty children dropping slates and throwing paper balls, and eating apples slyly and making faces at me behind their books, while the July sun streamed in at us all from every uncurtained window, was utterly distasteful to me. I had no heart for the work. When I was 10 years old I attended a district school. I had a teacher to whom we were all distasteful. She had no heart for the work. She was very cross to us. We did not like her in the least. I decided that I would not teach school. What next? There were very few avenues open, very few ways in which to turn. I had to think very hard. Sewing! I laughed a little, even in my perplexity. If there was anything more than another which was decidedly not my forte, that thing was sewing. I was not naturally of an idle disposition. Give me the proper utensils and I could work, a garden hoe, a broom, a slate and pencil, even a hammer and some nails, and all these I could and had used, but a needle and thread! Never those, when it was possible to avoid them. At my feet lay a newspaper. I picked it up and glanced aimlessly down a column of advertisements. The paper was one that Dr. Douglas had sent me the day before from the manufacturing town where he lived. Among the list of wants was a call for a bookkeeper in the paper box factory of Messrs. Sayles and Getman. I read that with some animation. This was certainly something that I could do. The paper did not specify of what gender the bookkeeper must be, but the town was only 10 miles away, and Dr. Douglas lived there. One friend, anyway, and at least it would do no harm to try. I looked at my tiny watch, Uncle Ralph's gift on my 16th birthday. There would be a train in 20 minutes. I sprang up, hurried myself into my brown alpaca dress, gloves, hat, and the like, and scampered downstairs, opened the sitting-room door to say to my mother, "I am going out for a little while, mother. I will be back in time to get tea," and then I started on the first little independent venture in my life. I remember that afternoon so very well. It seems strange to me that every little trifle connected with that venture should stand out so clearly before me tonight. It was a clear, crisp autumn day. The air had a brisk hint of winter in its touch, and yet a summer glory lingered in the sunshine, and everywhere there fluttered golden and crimson and brown leaves. They were lying in great glowing heaps over Esther's grave, as I caught a glimpse of it from the corner. They fluttered all along my path, and sometimes they seemed bright to me, and sometimes sad. I rustled through them, though, in a burning haste to catch that train, and Mr. Stewart swung me on the platform at last, after the train was in motion, a thing which mother would not have liked at all if she had ever known it. I found my way without difficulty to the box factory. I had been in the town often before, and noticed the sign. But how warm and tired and nervous I felt as I pushed open the outer door and entered a room piled high with boxes of all sizes and shapes and colors! How red my cheeks felt, and how horribly one ear burned! There was no one in the large room, so I made my way toward a door in the distance. In that next room sat a man with his feet on the stove in front of him. He arose as he caught a glimpse of me, and stood silent and indifferent, awaiting my order. "Is this Mr. Sayles?" I ventured. He bowed dignifiedly. "The same." Then I plunged into business, my left ear burning horribly the while. "I have called to see if I can secure the situation of bookkeeper. I saw your advertisement." Before Mr. Sayles answered me, he turned squarely around and gave me the benefit of a front view. It had been a sidewise one before. Then he gave me such a prolonged, thorough, scrutinizing gaze from the brown feather on my hat to the tip of my patent leather shoe, that he started the burning in the right ear. Then he spoke. "We have always employed men for bookkeepers." I was puzzled how to answer this, if it needed an answer, and he looked at me as though he expected one. I certainly was not a man, and if they always employed men, why, clearly, I would not do. Fortunately it occurred to me to say this aloud, and as I spoke I turned toward the door. "I am not so certain of that," Mr. Sayles answered meditatively. "Wait a moment, if you please, young lady. Because we have always employed gentlemen is no sign, you know, that we always must. What salary would you expect?" "I suppose I should expect the same salary that you would have been in the habit of giving your bookkeeper," I said, with considerable dignity. Whereupon he laughed and drummed with his fingers on the table before him, and seemed to think. "Well," he said at last, "I don't know. The idea is an original one to me. Do you know that, as my bookkeeper, you would have to be present at all sales, and keep a careful account of the same, and make out bills, and receive payment, and be responsible for considerable sums of money, besides looking after the shop girls, and keeping everything straight in that direction?" "I could do all that," I said. "At least I think I could. I am sure I would like to try." "And pay the hands every Saturday night?" he added, eyeing me attentively. "Certainly," I said, "provided I had money to do it with." "Well," he said again, after another good-humored little laugh, "suppose we talk this matter over in a business-like way. Take a seat, if you please. What name did you give me, ma'am?" And the end of our business talk was, that I was a regularly engaged clerk when I went out from the front door, and had promised to report myself in 2 weeks from that date, subject, of course, to my mother's decision, and in event of that proving unfavorable, I was to let him know on the following day. I went from the factory directly down River Street to Stone Street, and climbed 2 flights of steps, and knocked at the door of Dr. Douglas's office. "Why, my dear child," he said, rising and coming forward when he saw it was I, "what good fairy sent you hither?" Then, quickly and anxiously, "No one sick at home, I trust?" "No, doctor," I said gleefully. "I only represent myself to-day. I've come out to find a vocation, and I have found it. Only I have stepped out of my sphere." And then I told my story. The doctor listened attentively, doubted a little at first, then approved, but decidedly doubted my obtaining my mother's consent. I didn't, I told him, not in the least. Mother could see that I must do something, and this was honorable and not difficult, and mother was altogether too sensible to think I lowered myself by trying to secure honest work. "Of course," he answered quickly, "I did not think of such a thing. But you must remember, Julia, that you are very young to be thrown on your own resources, and your mother might very naturally object." "Very probably she will," I said. "But you see, objections will not pay my board and furnish me with the wherewithal to be clothed in, and bookkeeping will. So will you be kind enough to direct me to a possible boarding place?" "Suppose you leave that matter in my hands. Drop me a line tomorrow in regard to your mother's decision, and I will then undertake to secure a suitable boarding place. Meantime, if you are going home tonight, your movements must be speedy." I submitted to Dr. Douglas's hurrying, and was very glad to leave the rest of the business in his hands. I bustled around the little sitting room at home in a sort of subdued glee. My first independent venture, and its results elated me. I remember I steeped flaxseed instead of tea in our little teapot, and tucked up the muffins under the stove to bake, instead of in the oven. But I had a long, late, hard talk with mother. She was utterly unreconciled. Dear mother, she seemed to think that her first and greatest duty in life was to toil for and spare her children. Patient, faithful, tender mother! Tonight, as I recall her sweet, pale, tired face, I can think of no frown of impatience or anger that ever marred its sweetness. I can think of nothing left undone that she could do to smooth the path in which her children trod. I conquered at last. I knew I should, for what else was there to do? "To be sure," mother said, "the doctor is there. It isn't as if you would be quite away from us all. The doctor will see to you. If—" And then my mother stopped, and drew a little patient, submissive sigh, and went and sat at the east window, which looked toward the spot where Ester was sleeping, and I knew she meant to say, "If Ester was only living there now, as she would have been, if—" Ah me! I was gleeful that night, but it was gone in the morning. I wrote my note to Dr. Douglass in a subdued and businesslike manner, and went around afterward in a grave way, realizing that we were packing up, and the old home and the old life were going away from me together. I remember thinking, as I braided my hair, that I would wear it in braids across my head no longer. That childish fashion belonged to the little girl Julia, who had played through so many years of her life, and with whom this grown-up Miss Ried, who was going away from home to board and earn her living, had nothing in common any more. What desolate work it is, this packing! We had not so very much to pack. Mother sold all the furniture, except the great armchair in which father died, and Ester's little red rocker, and a few like treasures. House, and carpet, and furniture, all sold together; and sometimes I think that that was really the hardest part of it. If we could have taken down all the shades, and set the chairs upside down into each other, and tied them up, and piled boxes and trunks and rolls of carpeting and oilcloth in great heaps everywhere, utterly dismantled and disorganized everything, you know, it seems to me as if it could have been easier; but instead it was just turning the key on a very dear home thing, as if we were going out for only a walk or a little visit, and yet knowing and realizing that we would never, never come home to it all again. Mother had to go first. I was glad of that. I am glad of it tonight. I could not have had her lock those doors and take her last look alone. As it was, I stood on the doorstep while Brother Alfred, who had come for her, tucked her into the carriage and looked taller and more manly while he did it. I looked as if I might be going back into the house to hurry dinner, and have it all ready for them when they returned from their ride. Some strangers who passed by just then doubtless thought so. And yet we knew, we three, that the last dinner in that house, that would ever be enjoyed by us, had been prepared and eaten, and the dishes were all sold and packed and gone away. "Take good care of yourself for my sake, daughter," mother said once more, as they drove away. Dear mother! It almost broke her heart to go away and leave me standing there alone, and Minnie cried outright and bitterly, and Alfred pushed his hat over to shade his eyes, and would not look around at me at all. But I answered gaily, "Oh, I'm all right, the doctor will take good care of me." Then I ran in and shut the door, and I went out, away out to the back kitchen, and sat down on one end of the old wash bench, and I am glad mother never knew how hard I cried. It was hard, harder than I had dreamed. There was nobody to stop crying for now, nobody to care, and I just let all the tears that choked me, and fought at me, and been conquered by me, all the last 2 weeks, pour forth. I was supposed to be going to Mrs. Griswold's for dinner. Vesta was married, and was at home on a visit, she and her husband. He was a wealthy man from Washington. I knew he had brought Vesta's mother a fur cloak, and she was going back to Washington with them, to spend the winter. Vesta and I used to play together, and now my mother was gone. I did not go to Mrs. Griswold's to dinner. I did not have any dinner. It took all my time between the 11 and the 3 o'clock trains to shed my tears, and then to bathe my eyes from time to time, in hope that they would not look as though the tears had been shed. Finally I gave myself just time to lock the doors hurriedly, not stopping to peep into the family sitting room, and rushing quickly by Alfred's chamber door. I turned the last key while the whistle was blowing for the train, gave the entire bunch to Mr. Stewart's boy, who stood in the store door as I passed, and said cheeringly, "You will be late." And so at last, in haste and excitement, I turned away from my old home, and began my career in the world. But a few days before I had received a brief note from Dr. Douglass. I took it out on the cars, and reread it. "Dear Sister Julia, I have secured you a boarding place. Will meet the 3:50 train on Friday. Yours, Douglass." Meager enough information, this, concerning my new home, but all that I possessed. A wretched, drizzly rain was falling when the engine whistled into the station at Newton. I remember I felt glad of it. Nothing had seemed so seasonable, so in keeping with events, during all that day, as did the steady drip, drip of that dismal rain. I wondered what the doctor would say first; whether he would fall to pitying me, say, "Poor child," in that compassionate tone of his. If he did, I felt certain I should cry again, and that I felt too tired and wretched to do. What he did say was, "Have you rubbers on?" And all the way, as the carriage rolled down the streets, he said only the merest commonplaces to me, such, for instance, as, "That is Grace Church, that first building on the right," or, "Our mission Sabbath school is located in this vicinity." I wondered then if he knew how little I cared whether Grace Church was located on the bank or in the river. To all his remarks I made no answer, until finally he said, "Ah, here we are at home." Then I roused in great surprise. "Why, do you board here?" I said. "I certainly do," he answered, smiling. "So you see I shall have a fair opportunity to exercise my office of guardian in chief." The house, too, was a surprise to me. It was large and handsome; grand almost, only that it was in too exquisite taste to be called exactly grand. Why the people living in it should keep boarders was a mystery to me. I made my wonderment known to Dr. Douglass, and asked for a reason, while we waited in the gem of a sitting room for the entrance of somebody. He turned toward me with an amused shrug of the shoulders, and answered, "Wait 1 month, won't you, Julia, and then answer that same question for me." "What is the lady's name, doctor? You did not mention it in your lengthy and communicative letter." "The name is Tyndall," he answered briefly. I may as well say, just here, that it was watching Mrs. Tyndall, and listening to her, that led me first to desire to write this book; and because I saw and heard much of her, and saw to what uses she put her tongue, and saw the contrast between her tongue and the tongues of some other people, and the results of all this, I resolved to write it out for you all. And just then the door swung noiselessly and gracefully open, and Mrs. Tyndall entered. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Trisha G.